Thank you all for having me at this very worthwhile endeavor. I think it's great this school has been organized. I think it's especially great that so many people are here on Thursday of week 8 when I'm sure we all have lots of competing pressures and exhaustion to deal with. So great to be with you here tonight. So my brief was to talk about all of the politics of climate change, which is would take us a bit more time than we have tonight. So I've decided to focus on a sub-piece of it, what I think is a really exciting piece of it, and actually maybe a bit of an optimistic one, which is maybe not the majority of climate politics all the time. So I hope you'll ask lots of questions. I hope if you're thinking about parts of climate politics that are not what I'm talking about now, to raise questions about it. We're a nice small group, so please feel free to raise your hand and just jump in as I'm speaking, and then we can have a more developed conversation afterward. But no, thank you for being here. So can I first start with a question? How many of you were not born in 1992? Raise your hand. So not born. So nearly all of you. I was born in 1992. But in 1992, when I was in 4th grade, the countries of the world promised an international law to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. That was the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change promise to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. And since that time, countries have met once and twice and again 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 without making a huge amount of progress on that target, that promise indeed, that legally binding commitment they made to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate. And I've been told that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing again and again and again and to expect a different result. And so you might think this maybe raises some questions about the sanity of this process. But then they met yet again, a 21st time, and there they actually made quite a big change, quite a significant change. And I think that's worth reflecting on. But to get an evaluation of what that change means, I wanted to show you some anthropological evidence, ethnographic evidence I collected in an insalubrious Parisian nightclub on the night of December 12th, 2015, when the agreement had been signed and agreed. And all the delegates who were negotiating for 20 years, over 20 years together, found themselves together in this club. And let me see if you can hear what they're singing. Anyone recognize that song? So they felt like champions that night, right? And they felt like they had really achieved something. So the question I want to ask tonight is why, and what did they achieve? And my answer is this, that the Paris Agreement represents a shift in how we think about the international politics of climate change, from a state of gridlock to what I call a catalytic regime. There are 3 big changes I want to focus on. First, this long-term goal to decarbonize the world economy by end of the 21st century. And indeed, if we read the language about the balance between sinks and flows, then really it means kind of effectively decarbonizing the world economy in 3 or 4 decades to have any hope of remaining within the Paris temperature goals. A big specific commitment building on this 1992 promise. The second consequential piece, this is probably the one that's received most attention, is the move from what you might call a global deal framework, as embodied in the Kyoto Protocol, to what I call a pledge and review and ratchet system, where instead of having a top-down agreement from countries, you have instead a bottom-up system, as it's called. And in the old system, you had a kind of standard textbook international treaty, where everyone comes to a common agreement, everyone knows what they have to do, legally binding targets are negotiated and assigned and accepted and ratified by countries, and there's monitoring and to see if people keep those agreements or not. And the third piece, there's some enforcement. Now in the case of Kyoto, very weak enforcement, but some enforcement provisions as well. And Paris is very different. Right? It's a bottom-up system where countries get to decide for themselves what their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, should be. So that part is nationally determined. But there's international review, and there's an international commitment to ratchet up those NDCs every 5 years. So a pledge and review and ratchet system. Very different. One big difference that came out of the Paris Agreement on this second point was the number of countries that actually put forward a pledge here. So we'll talk about it in a minute, the Copenhagen conference and predecessors, but in Paris you had nearly 190 countries coming together and offering some kind of pledge. The first time you had both developed and developing countries taking on specific mitigation commitments at the same time. And these pledges, if you add them up, the UNFCCC's estimate is that they'll move us from a 4 or 5 degree world to maybe a 3.5 degree world. So not solving the problem, not reaching the temperature goal, but by far the biggest single reduction commitment in the history of the international negotiations. And the third piece, I think, is maybe one that's been less talked about, although is now permeating kind of our thinking about climate change in more and more ways, and for me, as an international relations scholar, represents a very radical shift in how we think about global collective action. The Paris Agreement welcomed into its broad tent a whole groundswell of activity from cities, from states and regions and provinces, from private companies, from investors, from civil society groups, from faith groups, from universities, and other kinds of actors. And actually gave these actors equal standing in the Paris Conference, called them the fourth pillar. They reached a huge scale and scope at the time. So thousands of different actors around the world are committing to different things. We're figuring out more and more what those add up to, but it's probably in the same order of magnitude in terms of emissions reductions as the national commitments themselves. Talk more about that in a second. But anyway, hugely consequential change. So I call this whole system a shift from what you might call a regulatory model, regulatory because it's telling a commonly agreed standard that everyone agrees to and then has monitoring enforcement, to what you might call a catalytic model. Catalytic because it's not trying to solve the collective action problem by creating a common agreement, but rather by boosting action over time and trying to create overwhelming and inevitable momentum to a common goal. So we'll come back to that at the end, but this is a big, big change. The question though is, can it work? Are there reasons for optimism? Or is this shift in the structure of international climate politics and the form of the institutions just shifting deck chairs on the Titanic? How much can this actually help us advance on this issue? That's, I think, the key question we have before us. So with you over the next hour or so, I just want to cover 4 brief points on these themes. First, to talk a bit more about what has changed exactly. What kind of institutional break does the Paris structure represent from the previous structure? What's changed? That's kind of a history part. Secondly, why has it changed? How can we explain this pretty radical shift in the politics of international climate change? How can we think about that? Third, this important point, will it work? Probably the most important point that we can think about today, and how can we make it work better? Some important questions. And fourth, and this is more of a general case, but what can we learn from this change for other areas of international cooperation? If you look around the world today, there are many topics in the realm of international politics which aren't going very well. So is there any lesson from this climate change laboratory that we can apply to other themes? So one of the few things I'm not going to talk about is what hasn't changed. And of course, in the Paris Agreement, there was a lot more progress on the mitigation side of the international climate regime than on, say, the adaptation or finance or loss and damage or some of the other issues you've probably been talking about over this 8-week term. So I'm going to focus on what's changed because that's the focus of the lecture, and that's going to be more mitigation, but I'm very happy to talk about the other topics and how they relate to international politics in a Q&A or as we go along. So that's on the agenda for tonight. Yeah, and as I said, please do jump in if questions arise or if anything's unclear. So let's start with what has changed. So as I said before, these are the 3 kind of big innovations I see in the Paris Agreement. I want to focus in particular on the second and third of them. So how do we move from this global deal model to this more bottom-up pledge and review and ratchet model? And how did this groundswell of activity from other actors come into the international regime? So let's start with pledge and review. If you look back to that 1992 treaty, you actually see some really interesting provisions which are now often not thought about in the international climate change realm. So Article 4 said all parties, meaning the countries, will formulate, implement, publish, and regularly update national and maybe regional programs containing measures to mitigate climate change. And indeed, they shall adopt national policies and take corresponding measures to mitigate climate change by limiting anthropogenic emissions, blah, blah, blah. And Article 12 said they would report that to the COP. So already in the 1992 convention, you saw the rudiments of a pledge and review system coming out, right? And indeed, if it says regularly update, a pledge and review and kind of ratchet up system. So this is an interesting part because it means that the kind of idea we've ended up with was to some degree already back there in history in 1992. Of course, it lacks specificity about who would take on these commitments, exactly what they would look like, how the review would work, how the ratcheting would work. So a lot not very well defined, but the idea is there. But that's not how people thought about the problem at the time. If you remember back to 1992, which of course you don't, but the key innovation at that time was the Montreal Protocol, the international regime governing ozone, which had started in the mid-1980s, and then through a series of protocols, the most important of which was the Montreal Protocol, created increasingly stringent global deals on ozone-depleting substances. And so that was the model in people's minds. And they thought, we have a problem like climate change. That's similar to an ozone problem. It happens up there in the sky somewhere. It's about what we do down here on the Earth, about certain kinds of emissions that go up there. And so we have a model for solving this. And indeed, that same model applied for many, many transboundary environmental issues. Over the 70s and 80s, there was this huge surge of treaties around these different questions. They all kind of had this similar kind of convention and protocol template. So people really thought they had a pretty clear way of going about solving the problem. And so they began to apply this logic to the United Nations Framework Convention process. And in 1995, in the first meeting of the parties of the UNFCCC, they agreed that this kind of convention and protocol model should be taken on, and they gave themselves a 2-year time space to negotiate one. And so the result of that was the treaty we're all aware of and familiar with, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. And this was always intended as a first step, right? The whole model was based on this idea you have sequential protocols that gradually increase in stringency over time. So Kyoto was a modest treaty. It was intended as a modest treaty. The average reduction commitment that rich countries took on was about 5% below 1990 levels. No one thought that was going to be sufficient to solve the problem, but it seemed like a good way to start moving forward. Of course, every country's exact level was different. It had a strict divergence between Annex 1 countries, meaning the developed world, and non-Annex 1 countries, meaning everyone else. And this, of course, proved very consequential later, but this was very much in this treaty, and it had various kinds of flexibility measures, like the clean development mechanism to create emissions trading between different countries to help them meet their targets more efficiently. So people thought this was great. This was the most kind of state-of-the-art environmental treaty ever agreed, and it was definitely what we wanted to have. Now, of course, it was so state-of-the-art that some people decided they didn't even want to be part of it. So in the lead-up to the Kyoto negotiations, the US Senate passed a non-binding resolution, but a very symbolic one, saying that the United States would never ratify a treaty that did not include specific reductions commitments for emerging economies at the time. Now, this was, of course, a bit of a shot across the bow before the negotiating process, but indeed the United States never joined the Kyoto Protocol afterward, even though the Clinton administration signed it, and then the Bush administration unsigned it in 2001. And of course, the other thing that changed over this time was that that kind of issue, the role of emerging economies, changed quite a lot because of the industrialization and growth of places like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and others this time. And so the balance of who was responsible quickly began to change, even if it remained a highly contentious issue. And so this modest treaty wasn't really that effective, even as it was negotiated, even if it represented the kind of best thinking available at the time. And indeed, the flaws became increasingly clear. It took a long time to get it ratified. It was supposed to go into force quite quickly after 1997, but it took a long time because it couldn't get at a sufficient threshold of ratification until Russia joined under great duress several years later. And even when the legally binding parts began to kick in, it soon became clear that they weren't that binding in practice. So, is anyone here from Canada? Does anyone remember what happened with Canada in the Kyoto Protocol? No? So Canada, it soon became clear, was going to be in breach of its commitment under the Kyoto Protocol. And as they realized they were getting close, they just decided to leave it. And they exited the treaty. So instead of facing the shame of not meeting their targets or facing the minimal penalties, they just left. So how binding was it in practice? Well, not very. So interestingly, if you look back in the history, a lot of people at the time of Kyoto didn't think it was the best idea. Actually, one of the key advocates of this view was someone named Steve Rayner, who was a professor here at Oxford in the it's a very complicated institute's name, Institute for Applied Sociology. I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, Google him. But he was working at one of the U.S. federal labs at the time, doing science, and thought this was a terrible idea. And that minority view, we'll see what happened to it later, became much more prominent. So Kyoto wasn't a great deal, but countries said, well, we didn't really try very hard. We could really try harder. We need to solve this problem. The problem is worsening. Science is improving, telling us more and more what we need to do. So let's try again. This is the point about the Kyoto Protocol as being a first step to nowhere. The point, though, is that a second step was never taken. So countries finally, after they got Copenhagen ratified, got around to deciding, okay, step one kind of didn't work, time for step two. And so they committed to negotiate a successor to Kyoto by 2009, when countries would meet in Copenhagen at COP 15. So there are many things written about why Copenhagen didn't succeed, but the basic problem, fundamentally, was a lack of agreement between the leading industrialized powers, particularly the United States, and the emerging economies, particularly China, on who should bear responsibility. There were many other parts as well, but that was the biggest bone of contention. And so no agreement was ultimately reached. It's also a bad negotiating strategy by the host. There were lots of difficulties with managing messages in the NGO community. There were a huge amount, various problems which you can talk about if you're curious, but the fundamental political difference between the United States and China and the blocs around them was at the core of it. And so the outcome was not a treaty, not a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, but rather a series of pledges, voluntary pledges by 60 countries, which were then, at the following COP, the following year, ratified and sort of brought into something called the Copenhagen Accord. So the Kyoto Protocol model, this path we started down in 1995, didn't really get us very far, and actually in some ways brought us back to that kind of soft, informal, ad hoc pledge and review system that the original 1992 treaty envisioned. So a bit of a circular and not very productive history. So what to do with that? So at this point, after Copenhagen, there was really a set of choices before the world about how the regime could evolve. One very likely possibility would be for the UNFCCC process to sink into the same sort of stasis that many other international processes experience. So, for example, there was a UN process on forests launched from the same 1992 Rio conference on other issues as well, which kind of petered out. And that is certainly a possibility for the UNFCCC. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen, we'll talk about why, but people began to articulate a new vision for what the climate regime might try to do. And actually one that built on this original idea of the pledge review in the 1992 treaty and the ad hoc outcome from Paris, from the Copenhagen summit. People said, how can we take this sort of reality and make it somewhat more positive? And so some gears started to turn in people's minds, particularly in the minds of people like Christiana Figueres, who joined the UNFCCC as the executive secretary at this time in the aftermath of Copenhagen, and in kind of the set of people around her thinking about these problems. So this led to a fundamentally different system at Paris. And let me just explain why the Paris Pledge and Review and Ratchet system is different from the Copenhagen outcome and different from the 1992 treaty. So yes, you have nationally determined contributions, pledges, but unlike the 1992 treaty, which wasn't clear if everyone had to take on mitigation obligations, everyone has to take on mitigation obligations and their pledges. So all must pledge emissions reductions targets. There is differentiation between developed and developing countries on the content of those mitigation pledges, but they're all mitigation pledges of some kind. So yeah, developed countries should have quantified economy-wide reductions. Developing countries shall progressively move toward them, but may have other kinds of commitment pledges as well. Secondly, in the Copenhagen model, there was no review. It was sort of left kind of as an informal ad hoc review, and in the original framework convention, the review mechanism was never specified. Paris has 3 separate review mechanisms, which are meant to provide a more robust form of review. So the first one is review of actual implementation. Have countries done what they said they would do? This is Article 13. Second kind is review of collective ambition. So are we, as a whole international community, moving as quickly and as strongly as we need to be toward the Paris goals? So this is sometimes called the global stocktake, which will happen in 2023 and has this year a component that's kind of precursor to that called the facilitative dialogue of the Paris Agreement, or now rebranded as the Talanoa dialogue. And last but certainly not least, there's something called the facilitative compliance mechanism, which if you look at Article 15, which is what this comes from, says that there will be a compliance mechanism which will be facilitative, non-punitive, constructive, friendly, a kind of very unclear compliance mechanism. Think back to the Kyoto one, maybe not so different from that, in fact. So what are these things? Well, the answer is we don't know, because countries give themselves until this year to finish negotiating the content of the review processes. So it's happening as we speak in different places around the world, and should be finished by COP of this year, in other words, by December. So the question of how robust this review mechanism is very much a matter of debate. It may come out in different ways. And if I had to guess, my guess is that it will come out medium, which is a bit of a common outcome, right? In international politics, everything ends up being a compromise. But that's my best guess now. A third part, though, and this is probably the biggest difference between the Paris pledge and review system and the previous ones, is that there's a ratchet. There's a mandatory, legally binding ratchet, which means you must update your NDC at regular intervals every 5 years, and that there must be progression in those NDCs, meaning they must be at least as ambitious as the one before. And so, again, this is an exhortation. There's not a formally binding sanction on it, but this is very much required to be compliant with the Paris Agreement. So a much more thought through version of pledge and review and ratchet than we had in the past. Any questions on any of those pieces before we move to the next? Yeah.
How do they define developing countries? I know there's like broad definitions, but there's sort of a gray area in the middle, especially with pollution.
Mm-hmm.
What's the definition within this framework?
So in the 1992 treaty, there was a clear list, Annex 1, which said these are developed countries, and they were essentially the OECD at the time, plus the former Soviet Union, and everyone else was not Annex 1, and that remains the case today.
So, okay.
Yeah, so it hasn't been updated. That's the short answer.
What does it mean, at least as strong as before?
So this is a great question which no one knows the answer to. So I don't have the text in front of me here, but I think the clause is something like, and there shall be progression in the level of ambition in successive NDCs. Maybe some of you know it. So what does that mean? Does it mean the number goes up? Does it mean that more scope is included? Does it mean that there's a higher certainty around the error terms? I mean, this is all to be discussed. Now, please.
Sorry, NDC stands for?
Nationally Determined Contribution. So these are the pledges. So pledges and NDC. Any other questions? Great, so the second piece of the big change I want to talk about was this groundswell of transnational governance and action from other sectors of society. And this is really quite different. So all around the world, cities, companies, investors, other kinds of sub and non-state actors have been acting on climate change for a long time. And indeed, before the countries began to act on it in many cases, there were different kinds of city level or province level things. And increasingly, those different actors began to reach out to each other around the world and form networks. Some were already existing networks that took on climate change. Some were specifically formed around climate change, like C40 you might have heard of, or the Green Business Coalition, or the International Investor Group on Climate Change, or things like this. And so what's interesting, though, is not that all of that's happening, it's that it's increased a lot in happening, and that it's been brought into the intergovernmental process, right? Usually international processes in diplomacy, only sovereign states have standing under international law, and therefore only they may agree treaties, only they may be the subject of treaties. And that's still, of course, true, but it's changing. It's changing in really interesting ways. And the Paris Agreement takes a big step in that direction. So just a quick clarification. By transnational governance, I mean governance systems, so things that are trying to provide public goods or regulation or set standards or build capacity or transfer funds or any things that are kind of functions you might think a government would do, but done across borders, so transnational, and done by things that aren't just sovereign states, so cities, businesses, NGOs, etc. And that's a word we use in the international relations literature to refer to this kind of more diffuse and heterogeneous form of governance. So how much is there in the world? This is just showing you the rise of different transnational climate governance initiatives over time. So like I said, there was some happening in the beginning of the regime and a lot more happening later on. And it's mixed, right? It's not just private actors or just public actors or just, but actually different kinds of actors working together. So an example just of a hybrid kind of mixed one is something like the New York Declaration on Forests, which was a declaration by about 300 actors in 2014, which pledged collectively to eliminate deforestation, that is, no more forests being cut down that are being planted, so net deforestation, by 2030. So a fantastically ambitious goal. And parties to this agreement are countries, especially forest countries like Colombia or Peru or places like that, companies that have forest products in their supply chains like Unilever, indigenous communities, people who live in the forest, and others as well. So a very kind of interesting coalition coming together. So lots of mixed actors coming together, and they do lots of different things. Different kinds of implementation of reductions, projects, standards, financing, information exchange is a big one, capacity building, etc. So how did this come to be part of the international intergovernmental process? So as I said before, people began to think differently after Copenhagen. They started to think we need to find new ways to attack this problem. And some of these kind of policy entrepreneurs really wanted to bring this kind of groundswell of activity into the process. Because remember I said, there's really a crossroads after Copenhagen. People could have abandoned the UN process. And indeed, some people at that time said, let's just forget about this. Actually, Steve Rainer is one of the people who said this. We should focus more on cities. We can focus more on the private sector. We can focus more on national policies. We can do all these other things. We don't have to solve this through a UN deal. And indeed, what good is it doing us? And so people in the UN process thought, we could either beat them or join them. And joining seemed like a better option than beating them. So one of the first steps here was a big conference that the UN Secretary General held, Ban Ki-moon, in 2014 in New York. And to this conference he invited heads of state, asking them to come and pledge what they were going to do, but also CEOs, mayors, governors, heads of big different kinds of organizations. And importantly, he didn't just invite them. He worked with them over the whole year preceding this conference to make sure they had something big to deliver. So the New York Declaration on Forests was one of them. There are many others as well. These kind of big announcements, big initiatives for how they would work together to accomplish this. And I don't know if any of you were there or remember in 2014, but it was accompanied by also a lot of civil society mobilization. So 400,000 people took the streets in New York at the same time. The biggest mobilization in the United States in New York since the 2003 Iraq War. So it really acquired a new attention. And importantly, the message was a different one than people had thought about before with climate change. The message was not just, this is terrible and we all need to come together to do something. It was that, but also that we can do something. We, cities, we, businesses, we, private companies, are doing something, and you can too. And so it's kind of a different way of thinking about the idea. But critically, this was not happening inside the UNFCCC at this time, right? This was the UN Secretary General, a separate entity, part of the UN family, but not the same one. And indeed, the organizers of that summit, so the Secretary General, but also the different groups that have been building it up to it, tried to then import it in the same year, just a few months later, to the COP20 in Lima. And the Peruvian government was a big supporter of this idea. They really were at the forefront of trying to bring other actors into the process, and so they really tried to do a big job there. They got rejected. Basically, they tried to put language into the decision at the Lima COP saying we recognize this, we support it, we want to do more, stuff to that effect, but it got taken out by countries that were worried about, different reasons. Some didn't like the idea of doing stuff on climate change. They were the dinosaurs. Some didn't like the idea of allowing other kinds of actors to have this standing in the process because they were jealous of their own sovereignty, which tends to be the case. Now, it wasn't the case that nothing happened, though. At COP20 in Lima, they announced something called the Nazca Platform, which is a slide I showed you before. This map of different cities comes from the UNFCCC's own website for the Nazca Platform, which is an online portal that tracks all the different action taken by cities and regions and companies and investors and people around the world. Why is it called Nazca? Well, because it came from Peru. And Nazca, in theory, stands for Non-State Actor Zone for Climate Action, but really stands for we Peruvians are branded this as we wanted to. So very good marketing by the Peruvian government there. And fun fact, Nazca was actually designed about 200 yards that way. At the Blavatnik School, when we were based over here on Merton Street before a new building was created, we had a workshop in 2014 before the summit that really helped to pull together the tracking function. So Oxford has played a small, but maybe hopefully important role in this discussion. Anyway, after the kind of setback at Lima, the Peruvian government said, no, we're definitely going to make this happen. And they were joined at that time by the French government, which is coming in as the host of the next COP in Paris, the really big one that people knew they had to make work. And they came up with a very innovative strategy. So they created something called the Lima Paris Action Agenda, which was the French government, the Peruvian government, also the UNFCCC, remember Christiana Figueres there was thinking about these issues, and the UN Secretary General. And this quartet of actors decided to spend the whole year between Lima and Paris mobilizing more cities, mobilizing more businesses, mobilizing more of these initiatives like they had done for the 2014 summit, but on a bigger scale. And I thought if we mobilize all this action, that's going to help move countries to be more secure in making their own actions more ambitious. It's going to create positive momentum that's going to help us get a deal. And so this culminated in the Paris Congress making this sort of groundswell of climate action, this action agenda, as they called it, the fourth pillar, alongside the national pledges, the financing agreement, national pledges, financing agreement, groundswell, and the Paris text itself, the four pillars of the conference. So great. And then subsequent steps in COP22 have tried to institutionalize that more. They appointed these formal champions who are appointed by the presidencies of the COPs to mobilize further actions. They've created a collaboration forum for these actors to get together, and the idea is to try to orchestrate and energize and mobilize more and more going forward. And this year we have a lot of things that are trying to do that. So you might have heard about this Talanoa dialogue. This is part of the kind of review processes I mentioned before. Called Talanoa Dialogue. There's a lot of national branding here. So Talanoa is a term from the Pacific because Fiji was the host of COP23, and it's meant to talk about, refer to kind of a community storytelling exercise, which is a important part of Fijian culture. And so they thought this would be a good way to talk about the international politics of coming together to try to think about a better deal. And this kind of open dialogue has been explicitly charged with drawing lessons and stories and ideas from the non-state actors as well as states. And non-state actors are going to organize another big summit. So you might see a theme here of summitry in California, hosted by Governor Brown, Governor of California, in September of this year. So watch out for that. Anyway, this is all to say, though, that this non-state actor mobilization has continued to pace, and looking forward, people see this as a really important part of this ratchet mechanism, part of not just the formal institutions, but the informal ones around the Paris Agreement that are going to help make it powerful. Because the idea is that this kind of action by non-state actors can actually help countries go further, faster than they otherwise would, in a few different ways. First, of course, by reducing emissions, you give countries more space to take on more ambitious actions, help them implement the promises they've already made, which makes them more confident. The idea is about taking steps in the future. You also are making indirect impacts on technology, on economic systems, creating new, cheaper renewable energy, creating new business models, creating new policy regulations that can be diffused and adopted by others. And you have these kind of positive political feedback loops. So, like I said, helping them deliver existing action, existing pledges, demonstrating that higher ambition is possible, providing political cover for national politicians, building new constituencies for greater action. All these things have kind of positive feedback dynamics. And the idea, the advocates of these positions think, is that these are tools to help countries move their policies up over time alongside the formal process. So we'll come back in a second to how this works, but that's the theory. Any questions at this point? Great. So quickly, sorry, a question over here. Yeah, please.
What exactly is in the text of the Paris Agreement, that section?
Of that section.
Yeah.
So I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but a few key things are calls upon what they call non-party stakeholders, meaning everyone who's not a national government, to take on commitments to mitigate climate change, to adapt to climate change, to build resilience against further climate change. Calls upon governments to recognize and support these actions. It appoints these two high-level champions to drive this forward. It recognizes the Nazca portal as a place to kind of track these things. It creates an annual review at the COP to ask the non-state actors that have made pledges to come back and report on how they're doing to the target. It calls upon for more representation from developing countries, which is a big, important issue in these politics. A few other things too, probably, but it's about a page. So why has this change happened? What led people to move from the 20 examples of trying to do the same thing that I showed you at the beginning to a new way of thinking about it? And before you think, well, it had to change, obviously, I'd like to suggest to you that actually it's quite surprising that we see the shift we've seen. We don't usually get innovation in multilateral diplomacy. We usually get stasis. That's by far the more common outcome. And if you think about other international processes, you can probably think of plenty of examples of that. So adaptation and innovation are rare things in these kind of things. And there's lots of systemic reasons for that. Multipolarity makes international politics harder to get to agreement, even if it's coming from a positive trend. Harder problems like climate change that penetrate deeply into domestic policy space are just hard to solve through our traditional tools. Institutions, once they're created, are great, but they also have inertia, and so that you lock in suboptimal equilibria, which tend to persist over time. Think about, for example, the decision in 1992 to create this very stark line between developed and developing countries that can never change. That's obviously a bit of a necessary thing at the time, but maybe one that should have some kind of updating technique going forward. And of course, as you get more difficult and more institutions that are bumping up against each other, you get kind of fragmentation and redundancies and overlaps, and are not always productive. So, yeah, you might think, well, of course it was broken, so we had to change it. And so the old system broke. Yeah, that's one thing, but it's almost never the case in politics anywhere where something not working is therefore an explanation for it to be fixed. That's not really how politics works, unfortunately. You might also think it was just good diplomacy, that the French did a really good job of bringing people together and finding the right deals, and they absolutely did. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's not going to be the most important determinant. Or you might think, most importantly, these changes are not meaningful. We'll come back to that question when we get to the will it work point. But these are three kind of what I call facile explanations. My explanations, though, are slightly different. And this is important because important to understand as a set of informed guesses, not as something I can demonstrably prove to you, but this is from my observation of it. More archival work will eventually need to be done, more kind of detailed interviews will need to be done, we need more information. This is my take on it as an observer. So take it in that sense and not as a kind of proven facts. I think there were four basic positive factors here. The first was a series of background trends that have been building for some time, but many of them reached a kind of critical point after Copenhagen. So new knowledge and costs of climate change. You've talked about the science of it. I don't know if you talked about in your previous sessions about how the science kind of sharpened over time, but there was a big kind of step forward with AR5, with the IPCC's fifth assessment report, which really, for many countries, gave a much clearer indication of the severity of the problem and the steps needed to avert it than had been the case in the past. So I think that was a building kind of certainty around science was an important factor. Equally important, though, was a different kind of understanding about the costs and benefits of climate policy. And you had, for example, in 2010, something called the Stern Review, a big report by Laura Stern, who's at LSE, an economist, basically saying, yeah, climate change might cost us something, but not doing something is going to cost us a lot more. And promoting the idea that actually the things you need to do to mitigate climate change can be net positive economically. And so you saw the emergence of this green growth narrative around this time. Of course, they've been building for a while, but it really kind of took on a big step forward in the aftermath of the Copenhagen summit. And again, this is not random. This is a strategy chosen by policy entrepreneurs looking for new ways to advance on the issue. They thought this would be an effective one. And if you think, just if you look at the kind of number of organizations now that kind of espouse, even if it's just rhetorically, a kind of green growth idea, it's amazing how quickly ideas have changed around that between the first part of the century and today. And of course, you had technological change, and this is a big one we'll come back to, but the costs of mitigation aren't just changing people's minds about what the cost should, how they should value the costs. They actually really did change. Increasingly, around Paris, you saw sharper and sharper falls for renewable technologies in particular. So that had a positive effect. But probably the most significant political change was the change in the domestic politics of this issue in two very important countries diplomatically, the United States and China. And you remember from the Copenhagen discussion, these were the two chief barriers in 2009 because they couldn't agree on a way forward, and they kind of brought everyone down to their standard. Very different situation here. So what had changed? Well, in China, air pollution had become a much more politically salient issue. And the big kind of tipping point in China, and this was in 2010, where the government sort of which had previously described smog as fog, began describing it as smog due to kind of concerns from middle-class people in cities. And that led to a much more firm kind of government-level interest in doing something about the pollution issue, which of course is not the same thing as climate change, right? Two separate things, but one that was very much conflated in the public's mind with climate change. And so one where the Chinese government saw a real political incentive to be seen as more and more of a leader. And not for wrong reasons, right? Someone in northern China lives 5.5 years less than they otherwise would on average. That's a pretty striking statistic. In the United States, the situation was a little bit different. So, of course, in Copenhagen, Obama was president, but he was focused on other things. He was focused in his first term, you might remember, on healthcare. And so this was seen as a secondary concern. Also, what else was going on in 2008, 2009? Do you remember? Global financial crisis. So there's a lot. He was trying to get a stimulus package passed. So the Obama administration, the White House, just hadn't done its work in Copenhagen. It wanted to come to a deal, but it didn't have the investment in it. Come to 2015, the second term of Obama, he has more freedom to be strong on this issue because he's not up for election again. And the healthcare and stimulus thing, and actually the migration thing, which had also gone at that point, had all kind of dropped off the agenda. And this was one where President Obama, really personally, in my view, felt he had an opportunity to leave a legacy. And so really invested the full apparatus of the federal government in moving forward. The United States had tried to pass a kind of cap and trade bill in 2010 through Congress. It had failed. And so Obama thought, well, I can't get it through Congress. I'm just going to go all out on what I can do with my own power. So a very different situation in the United States as well. Add to that, the relations between China and the United States have been going kind of downhill in this time. After the financial crisis, there was a lot more what the United States would describe as an assertive Chinese policy, both financially and in the South China Sea, and that provoked more and more tensions. And so when the two leaders met, they needed to have some issue they could point to as progress, as a kind of common point of understanding. And increasingly, climate change became that kind of point. So ironically, the increasing tensions led to climate change winning out. Third, this groundswell of climate action outside the UNFCCC really leapt forward after Copenhagen, precisely because people were worried that maybe the UN process wouldn't deliver, and so people decided to take action into their own hands. This is when the C40 cities was created. And this is the point I keep coming back to. A different vision of how we solve the problem was articulated by leaders like Christiana Figueres, by the French government, by the Peruvian government, by the UN Secretary General, by many people. So this vision of what we could do came forward. So all of that added up, I think, plus a lot of good diplomacy and a bit of luck, to a Paris Agreement. We're going to switch now to the maybe most important question. Will it work? Can it work? How can it work? But any questions on the explanatory factors before I do?
I haven't fully grasped the very last point about the different vision.
So as I said at the beginning, people tried the same thing for 20 years or more. And there's a lot of cognitive inertia around this problem. We have to have a legally binding treaty that has a certain rigid form, people thought, because there is no other way. And they were really convinced of that. So to be able to support a different way of doing things, they had to be convinced that something might work. And that took persuasion, it took vision, it took bringing people to that view. So there's a real role for agency. I'll come back to this point later when I talk about the implications, but we shouldn't underestimate the kind of lock-in, mental lock-in that comes around these things.
So you said, it took a lot of convincing to come up with a different way of doing things. But then could you say a bit more about what the different ways of doing things were? Because at the start of the talk you said that even in 1992 they had kind of the peer review lined out in a way. So what?
Yeah. So in 1992, I was trying to make the point that they did have a kind of rudimentary pleasure review thing, but they didn't really think that was going to be how it worked. Okay. And actually, they thought this kind of ozone model was the way to go. And there are people to this day who feel this way. Maybe it's true. We'll come to that in a second, right? Whether this will work or not. But if you think about these two kind of ideal types, a kind of regulatory style treaty like Kyoto, like the Ozone Protocol, like the vast majority of international environmental treaties, or this Paris model, which I call a catalytic regime, other people call soft or bottom up. So that's a bit different of thinking of. Any other questions on this? Will it work? Well, remember, you probably saw figures like this previous sessions. This is basically where we are on the path to, remember, zero. We have to get to zero. That's what the Paris Agreement tells us. So current policies are taking us somewhere in this direction. This is, by the way, showing us the global emissions gap from the UNF gap report. And NDCs may be somewhere around here. So we're looking at, for a 2-degree scenario, maybe a 14 gigaton gap by 2030. These little bars here are showing you some different estimates people have put out about how much of the non-state actor commitments might add on. So some of them, of course, overlap with the NDCs in certain ways, and some of them might not overlap with NDCs in certain ways and go further and faster. As you see, there's a lot of uncertainty about where we are. And actually, one of the interesting projects going on now is to try to get a much more vigorous estimate of that. So we should know some better information there this year by the California summit about how much we are. But anyway, even in the most ambitious scenario, we still have a pretty big emissions gap for 2 degrees, not to say nothing about 1.5 degrees. So if you accept this chart, and obviously you might have different views on it, I'll let Miles talk to you about that if you want. There's a big step forward in Paris, right? We go from here to here, and that's consequential, and that's actually the biggest step that's ever been had before. But it's a long way from here, right? It's a very long way. So, in climate change, we're in the realm of progress being defined as outcomes being less worse than they otherwise would be. That's the cruel reality of climate progress. And so the kind of optimistic frame around Paris sometimes sits uncomfortably with this sort of graphs like this, because they show us exactly how much further we need to get to. And so we shouldn't be in any way starry-eyed about that or not take it seriously. At the same time, understand that the difference between this path and this path, or maybe even if we get somewhere like that, is a difference of hundreds of millions of people's lives probably over the course of the century. It's a big deal. So that's what we should think about progress. But actually, I think there's a few things to suggest that we can be a bit more positive than that kind of graph suggests, because this is the snapshot of where we are now. But the whole point of the Paris Agreement is about catalyzing more and more action over time, right? Ratcheting it up. And so if the Paris Agreement works, it's going to have to do this every time. And of course, we're getting close to reaching our carbon budget, where we won't be able to have much space to ratchet. But then it's a question of how much further, more quickly you do it, right? So the whole potential here is in the kind of dynamic nature of the agreement, not its static nature. And that's where I think our analysis and our evaluation needs to come. So what's happened since Paris? Well, a few good things. People thought Paris would come into force in 2020. That was the kind of target they set for themselves. And by coming to force, you have to have a certain threshold of ratifications from countries. and actually came into force remarkably within a year of being signed, which is unprecedented. No treaty comes into force that quickly, and actually it did, and that was largely due to the pushing of the French government and the outgoing Obama administration. Consequential. You've also seen a huge expansion of this groundswell I've been talking about. So many, many more cities, given this kind of opening, the spotlight the Paris Agreement shined on things, have taken even more steps to go forward. And today you actually have one of the biggest networks, the C40 network, saying that to be a member of C40, you have to have a 1.5C compatible target by 2020, which means essentially you have to have a carbon neutrality target of 2050, which is pretty impressive for big cities, especially big cities in emerging economies, to take on. You have obviously some very important developments outside the UNFCCC model. So that ozone treaty that we've been talking about has still been chugging away, and actually has produced a very consequential agreement on HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which were the thing they brought in to replace the ozone-depleting substances. Turned out they actually were horrible for climate change, but now have a very ambitious target to regulate them. So that's probably about half a degree, some people say. Half a degree, rather. You had a tipping point in energy investment, which was very interesting last 2016, the year after the Paris Agreement. You had suddenly, for the first time, more investment in green energy than brown energy for the first time ever. So first time for a long time. And that's a really interesting tipping point. And actually now you see many, many places around the world, renewables are cost competitive with fossil fuels, even counting for intermittency effects. So renewables plus battery storage being cost competitive with fossil fuels, which is really quite a remarkable tipping point. Now, of course, that's not solving the problem, right? We don't think there's a silver technological bullet, but it's certainly a consequential evaluation. And just more recently, you've probably seen all the news on electric vehicles increasing in scale. Manufacturers committing to come up with huge numbers of models by 2020. Jurisdictions like this one planning to ban fossil fuel vehicles by the 2030s. So a lot of positive steps. What about some less positive steps? So the German media had some very good covers about the Trump decision. And Trump, of course, decided last year to announce his intention to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. So what happens here? And this kind of specific case is just a very dramatic and very early test to this whole bottom-up model, right? Because the idea that countries can choose what they want is great if everyone's moving in the right direction, but what about if countries aren't moving in the right direction? How does this kind of treaty work when you have that situation? And what if next year it's not Trump, but someone else, like China or someone else? So I'd suggest to you that this is actually not a huge problem for the Paris Agreement over the long term, even though it's a very consequential move in the shorter term. And there are a few reasons why. The Paris Agreement is quite a resilient one, and indeed this kind of bottom-up flexible structure, I would say, makes it more resilient than it might otherwise be. One very clear provision is that to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, it takes 4 years. You had 1 year to announce it, and then 3 years for it to go into effect. So why is it 4 years? Well, not by accident. People writing the Paris Agreement thought exactly about this scenario. And so, as I said, Trump has announced his intention to withdraw the United States, but should he get the paperwork done on time? It's not always clear in this White House whether things will happen on time. It means the United States could at the earliest exit the Paris Agreement on November 4th, 2020. Does anyone know what happens on November 3rd, 2020?
Election?
The American election, right? So that's not by accident. So we'll see what happens. But more importantly, this kind of structure of pledge and review means that you have nationally determined contributions. And so countries are doing taking on the pledges that they think matter for themselves, right? This is what our national interest says we should do. And in that kind of world, your action, your pledge is not conditional on someone else's like it is in the Kyoto Protocol. So we shouldn't necessarily expect other countries to go back on their commitments. And indeed, after Trump's election, it happened during the COP23, which was happening in Morocco. A lot of people staying up very late in the night watching it. A lot of people were very disappointed by the result. That very next day, despite the kind of shock the people in the climate change realm felt, the Conference of the Parties adopted a unanimous resolution pledging to reaffirming their kind of commitment to the Paris goals. And indeed, people said the same thing after Trump announced the withdrawal in June. So the kind of infection you might suspect would happen hasn't occurred yet. Critical question though is whether countries up their game next time. That's the more important one to look at. So we'll see. More groundswell going forward since Trump has made his announcement. Indeed, they might even get stronger. And of course, these changes in the real economy are driven by global long-term trends, not election cycles. So if you're a car company deciding what to invest in for R&D, or if you're an investor deciding about where to invest pension funds, which have to be made in perpetuity, election cycles aren't very long. So there might be some more resilience. And indeed, there might be a little Trump bump for climate action in some ways. So since Trump made his announcement, actually a lot of non-state actors in the United States, cities, government, governors, private sector actors, investors, civil society groups, faith groups have redoubled their efforts. Indeed, so much so that some people are pledging that these bottom-up actions will allow the United States to meet its Paris Agreement despite what happens in Washington. It's not out of the realm of possibility, it's feasible. It depends a lot on how quickly the court process of undoing the Clean Power Plan unfolds. So it's kind of more about that than about the new pledges. But it's certainly in the realm of possibility. And, you know, there's a lot of interesting polarization on the issue now. And actually by withdrawing, Trump has maybe increased the political salience of this issue, which never had before. So even though Americans, like most people around the world, generally believe in climate change, generally support it, very few people vote on this issue. Making it so visible might change that, particularly in certain parts of the Democratic base. So we shall see. But that's not to be too optimistic, right? There's a few critical things to look at going forward. So like I said, this year is a really critical year. Will this Talanoa dialogue come up with a clear signal to step up ambition by 2020? We're kicking off that process now. We'll see how it goes. We have a big challenge this year because the host of the climate conference, the COP24, is Poland. And Poland has not been traditionally a strong actor on climate change, and of course has a government at the moment which is at odds with many parts of the international community on many issues. So we'll see how that goes. You also have this idea that countries have to finish negotiating the rule book, that is the review and ratchet process this year. We'll see how that comes out. We'll see how the California summit actually is, how much they're able to mobilize more commitments that shift the needle a bit. So a few really big outcomes to pay attention to this year as we look to raise ambition in 2020. The other big variable that of course everyone's thinking about these days is where China will come out. So after the Trump decision in particular, Xi Jinping and other top Chinese leaders have been very clear that they see the Paris Agreement as an important agreement, that they are committed to delivering it, and that they think others should too. But the big question is not so much what China does domestically, that's hugely consequential, but whether it actually uses its new influence to push others to go further faster. And that's unclear. There's many, many aspects of China's role in the world that are unclear at the moment, but this is maybe one of the most important ones. And if you think about things like the Belt and Road Initiative or other kinds of investments that China's making in infrastructure around the world, here that's kind of where the lock-in will happen or not happen. So these decisions are very consequential and not by any means, to my mind, decided yet. Yeah.
So could you just spell out why, sorry, it's probably a really ignorant question, but why Trump, what China losing its influence has to do with the Trump? Sorry, what's that?
So, remember, we got the Paris Agreement in some part, I would say, because of this G2 leadership between the United States and China. And without that double driver, we have to have hopefully one engine on the plane. Will China be that engine? Don't know. To be determined. Sorry, I don't want to take too much of our time because I know we want to have a good conversation. Let me just quickly end by talking about a few ideas what this kind of change means for world politics more generally. So I'd make three quick arguments. First, we can overcome gridlock. This case of the climate regime changing is a really rare one, like I said, but a really important one for exactly that reason. And actually, the agency of the key actors can matter. So the US and China making this very consequential decision, the IO leaders deciding to articulate a new vision, cities and businesses getting involved. These are changes that actual people made, decisions they made, that despite very difficult structural barriers, very difficult politics, created this breakthrough. Breakthrough of meaning in institutions and structures. So that's an important lesson. But the two I want to talk a bit more about are the next two. So we often see climate change and climate mitigation as a tragedy of the commons. In other words, a classic collective action problem where we all would benefit if we all took a common step forward, but no one wants to make that step unless he or she knows that everyone else is going to do so as well. Because we all would prefer not to do it and just let everyone else solve the problem for us. In other words, we'd all prefer to free ride on what others can do instead of doing it ourselves. So that's how we've almost always thought about climate change. What I'm hoping to suggest to you is that actually we can see it as a different kind of problem as well. It's not like one or the other is true, it's rather how we think about them, how actors think about them. And you might think about them as a tipping point, which I'll say more about in a second. And thirdly, if that's true, then Paris Agreement and institutions like it can be catalytic. That means they can advance international cooperation not by solving this sort of collective action problem, but rather by shifting preferences over time. So let me say a bit more about what I mean by that. So remember, the tragedy of the commons has this very nasty problem structure. Problem structure is a word we use in political science to talk about the kind of features for problems. So the intensity of the distributional conflict, number of actors, the rules of the game, etc. So it has this very nasty problem structure that we've talked about. And the implication is that you don't act unless you know everyone else is acting. So you need to have a kind of regulatory treaty, a collective deal, someone to tell you what to do, and somewhere in domestic settings to overcome this collective action problem. But in a tipping problem, you have a different set of assumptions. Actually, it's quite similar, but a few key things are different. First, and most importantly, action generates increasing returns over time. Anyone doing politics knows what we mean by increasing returns in this case? Anyone? This is a really important idea, right? That increasing returns means that the more you do something, the more likely it is that you will continue doing that thing. There are many, many different mechanisms through which this happens. It's a very important kind of feature of political behavior. In other words, there's something called path dependence, and the choice you take in time one makes that choice more likely again in time two. So action generates increasing returns in a tipping situation. And also actors have very heterogeneous preferences, right? So in the tragedy of the commons, no one wants to be the sucker. No one wants to do something, they'd rather everyone else do something. But actually, in a tipping situation, there are some people who will do it no matter what, and some people who will never do it. And so what you have is a lot more heterogeneity of what people are willing to do. So if that's true, you can have a different sort of problem, right? You have a relationship between the amount of action, that's this bottom axis here, and the preference of different actors to act. And these actors could be countries or cities or businesses or even individuals. And the idea of a tipping scenario is that you move from a situation where most people don't want to do anything, where action is negative for most, to something where you actually have a positive incentive to act. And that's true if you're in this kind of world, where you have large increasing returns and actually might get some sort of logarithmic relationship between the two. Maybe there's a few increasing returns, you're on a more gradual trajectory, or maybe, as in the tragedy of the commons, there's no effect, no assumed effect of action on other action, and so you have no relationship between these two things. So which actually is it? Well, I think we have to think about in our minds several ways where there are different kinds of ways in which previous action affects future action in the realm of climate change. We can think about also ways where the number of actors might affect cooperation. I'll skip that one for now. And then, of course, the big heterogeneity we see in people's preferences. But let's look at this as the first one of these, the most important one of these, this idea of increasing returns. In climate change, we have tons of this going on. We talked before about the role of technology changing. And if you look at this, this is a very clear case of where action in the past can make action in the future more likely. So does anyone know in the 1980s what the one place in the world was that had any sizable installation of wind and solar capacity?
Some spacecraft?
No? Good. So this was on the planet, but good guess. Anyone know? It was actually California, so not terribly surprising. In the early 1980s, late 1970s, the current governor of California was actually serving his first term as governor of California way back in the day. He was kind of out there. This was California, this was after the 60s, everyone was kind of investing in this hippie stuff. And so they spent a lot of tax for his money, building some really expensive wind turbines and some really expensive solar panels. But actually, many of the companies that helped them build those wind turbines in particular turned out to be Danish companies. And as they got better at doing this, they began to realize, maybe actually we could do a bit more of this. And the Danish government saw this as an opportunity for industrial policy and gave them some generous incentives at home. And so Denmark kind of came up and was joining California as the 2 places in the world now that had wind power. And that created some interest across the border in Germany, where in the early 1990s, the government began offering some subsidies, and then much more so after the Green Party joined the government in the mid-1990s, and you had suddenly Germany overtake both these other places as the primary market for wind power. And over time, this began to bring down the cost curve quite a lot. So by the time Germany reached a high kind of level of installation, not high by our standards today, but high versus the historical trend, the costs had fallen dramatically. So if you add up the different subsidies, let's get the numbers right here, between 1970 and 2000, California, Denmark, and Germany, those 3 places spent 986 million, 700 million, and 1.9 billion respectively on research and subsidies for wind power. And during that time, wind power fell in cost by 85%. So the rich and green jurisdictions were willing to pay this cost. It wasn't huge, of course, these are rich places, and did so not because they thought there was some sort of collective action problem that they were going to be taken advantage of, because they wanted to. They thought this was the right thing to do. And that really changed the impact of the choices that subsequent actors had, right? So, does anyone know the state in the United States that is currently the leading, has the most wind power?
Rhode Island?
Rhode Island, no. Rhode Island is the first state to have offshore wind. The only state so far to have offshore wind. But the most wind power, anyone know? It's Texas, actually. Not what anyone would think of as a particularly environmentally advanced place, but actually has a huge amount of wind and also solar, because the conditions there are good and the technology is so cheap. So cheap. And yeah.
Sorry, when you say that they developed them because they wanted to, what do you mean by that? Did they want to for what reason?
So they, it's a good question. These are places that thought we should do something good to the environment, and they wanted to do something for altruistic, pro-green reasons. And politicians, which are often not able to make those kinds of choices, had incentives to make those choices in these places because they were facing populations of voters that were demanding these kind of things and would be good. So when Jerry Brown was trying to get reelected, he said, look, we had an oil crisis in California in the 1970s. I'm doing something good about that. I'm building these really funky things called wind turbines. And Californians like that. Obviously they weren't huge in scale, so it wasn't that costly to do. So anyway, there's other mechanisms to which this kind of increasing returns accrue, which I won't talk about now, but network effects, where the more of something you have, the more useful it is, like email or telephones or fax machines or electric cars. Informational effects, like demonstration about the ability to have high levels of renewables in grids. Learning about how to do complicated policy activities like emissions trading, normative changes. We haven't talked much about this, but very happy to talk about in Q&A if you're interested. People's ideas for what's appropriate and right change, right? About a whole bunch of different behaviors. And a very important set of political economy drivers too. The more you build up new industries, the more you create ideas about what's appropriate, you get people who then want more and more of that because they have political voice and agency and an interest in defending their interests, which happen to be aligned with global climate action. So for all these reasons, you have a desire to, you have this increasing returns idea. And you pair with that, you have all the parts of the Paris Agreement that try to make this happen. So they try to facilitate cooperation not by solving collective action problems. They couldn't do that, right? They tried the regulatory model, it failed, but rather by shifting preferences over time. And there's 4 mechanisms you can think about there are these things that the Paris Agreement tries to do in different ways, and the other international agreements try to do as well. So shape future expectations and aspirations. This is what the long-term goal is trying to do, right? It's trying to change what people think will happen in the future in order to change how they act now. And if they change how they act now, they actually make that thing that they want to achieve more likely. And if this sounds a bit wishy-washy, think about something like monetary policy, something every central bank around the world tries to do every day. right? It tries to create the market's expectations about what the inflation rate will be, what the level of growth in the country will be, etc. And by doing it's successful in doing that, then it actually makes it happen. So expectation shaping can be a powerful tool. Paris Agreement tries to stimulate first movers, right? It's giving people flexible ability to set their own targets so that you get the most ambitious actors, the Californias and Germanys, et cetera, to put out their best, put their best offer forward, not to have a least common denominator thing. And of course, that kind of flexibility is fine if you gives you the good guys, but also gives you the bad guys. But if your kind of assumption is that what people want to do will change over time, the iteration part, then flexibility is okay, right? Because you're updating all the time and you're capturing those quick updates through the flexibility. And finally, there's lots of things in the Paris Agreement that are trying to diffuse kind of informational innovation mechanisms to increase the effect of prior action on subsequent action, doing all these kinds of things. Remember, this effort to build up domestic constituencies that we talked about, to mobilize cities and businesses, is doing exactly that, right? It's reaching into the black box of domestic politics, trying to empower constituencies to take a more aggressive line in national policies. So can it work elsewhere? Well, I think it's unlikely to work where the costs of free riding are high. Think about an issue like nuclear proliferation, where if you have some outliers, it's going to cause a big problem, right? In a tipping model, outliers have to not matter very much. The kind of laggard outliers, at least. So it's not going to work in those kind of cases. And it's not going to work where you only have a few kinds of actors that can affect the problem. Again, something like nuclear proliferation, where governments alone kind of hold the levers of power. But a lot of things we're trying to work on, indeed many of our sustainable development goals, are not like that, right? They're much more similar in problem structure to climate change. And that's where we have a real opportunity, I think, to take some lessons here to other places. So it's a surprising and incomplete evolution. One that offers some promise, offers some exciting ideas, but has no guarantee. So I think the Queen lyrics that they were singing there really sum up exactly where we are. And actually the interesting part here, and one that I find exciting as a researcher, and I hope you find exciting as people thinking about these issues, is that this kind of model gives a role for all of us to be part of the solution, right? We're all trying to move to this common target. We all have a role we can play in making it happen. It's not just something that happens between diplomats negotiating with diplomats in the quarters of power, but it's something that Oxford, the city, Oxford University, your colleges, you as an individual can actually contribute to. And so we are all the champions, I hope. Anyway, thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions.